Good day and welcome to our next talk in our series Why Christianity Needs to Change or Die. Now, Christianity is far along the way just to die out as a religion, especially in the Western world. In the first world countries where you go around to be religious and to be Christian is not the rule anymore. It is kind of the exception. And there's various reasons for that. And one of the most important reasons for that is that Christianity never changed through the consciousness change of humankind. So as people developed and consciousness changed and awareness woke up and became bigger and bigger, Christianity didn't do that. It just sticked with the old traditions and even ignored a lot of scientific proof that the dogma of the old church is definitely not the Alpha and the Omega. It's not correct. And that is in plain sight when we take into account all the archaeological findings that we have in recent years. One of these archaeological findings that we had is the Dead Sea Scrolls that was found in the caves in Qumran, and it was part of the Essene community that lived and stayed in the village of Qumran. Now, Qumran is close to the Dead Sea. This community started right after the first Maccabean revolt, which was more or less 150 BCE, before Christ, when the Maccabean family revolt against the then Greek Empire and kind of pushed the Greeks out of Jerusalem and proclaiming the independence of Jerusalem and the Jewish people again. The next step in this was they also cleansed the temple from the Zadoks. Now, the Zadok family was the high priests since the time of Aaron, which accompanied Moses on his route to the Pharaoh in Egypt to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt and out of slavery. So since that event, the high priests in that did service in the tabernacle and later on in the temple in Jerusalem came from Aaron's family, which was the Zadok family. Now, after the Maccabean revolt, this family was pushed out due to political situations, and they were replaced by the Hasmoneans, or the Hasmonean family. Now, a lot of rabbis and religious leaders did not go with this because this shouldn't have happened. And they removed themselves from the temple and the religious institution in Jerusalem, and they moved to Qumran, and they formed the Essene group. They were also very against the later Romans' influence in the temple, because the Romans started to appoint the high priests when they took power in Jerusalem, and also went on with this pushing out of the Zadok families and put in their place the Hasmonean family, which was controlled then later on by the Roman Empire. So the Romans combined the power of state and religion into the high priest and the Roman governor in Jerusalem, and the Essenes, the new group that was formed in Qumran, were very much against that. We must also remember that these Essenes were three groups. The Essenes that lived in Qumran, and the global group was also known as the Essenes. Then there was a second group, the Nazarenes, who lived just close to Mount Carmel, which is close to the modern city of Haifa in Israel. And then there were a third group, the Therapitai, and the Therapitai lived in the eastern parts of Egypt, and later on they extended to Alexandria, because Alexandria became a wisdom hub with the library and all the different traditions that came together there, and there were a lot of growth and philosophies and talk, and the Therapitai were part of the Alexandrian explosion of wisdom and growth within the wisdom traditions. Now Jesus, and we spoke about that earlier in an earlier video, Jesus was called the Nazarene, and most Christians believe it is because the book of Matthew, or the Gospel of Matthew, says he came from the town of Nazareth. Now that is absolutely not true. The stories of the birth of Jesus were later added to the Gospels. The oldest gospel that we have, as you know, is Mark, and there's no story of a birth narrative in that gospel. So Luke and Matthew added the stories of the birth to give it a fuller story about the life and work of Jesus. And in these stories, it was said that they came from Nazareth, which couldn't be true because Nazareth at the time of the birth of Jesus did not exist as a town. It was a little village at the foot of Mount Carmel where the Nazarene lived. And they were called the Nazarenes, and the village were called Nazareth. But it's not the same as the later town that we find today in Israel, which is the town of Nazareth. That town was established many years after Jesus lived on this earth. So Jesus did not come from Nazareth. Let's face that, and that's the truth. There's no archaeological findings that prove that Nazareth existed in his time. And Josephus, which is a Jewish scribe and a historian, which lived during the time of Jesus, and he wrote extensively about the Palestine and what happened there, and he traveled a lot. He never mentioned the town of Nazareth, and he wrote extensively about all the villages and towns in Palestine at the time of Jesus. So there are a lot of proof that Nazareth didn't exist. So Jesus was called a Nazarene because he grew up in the Nazarene village at Mount Carmel, and he was part of the Essenes. This can be proved because he went to John the Baptist. Now, John the Baptist was his cousin on the one side, but John the Baptist was also a very influential member of the Essenes in the Qumran community. It was believed that John the Baptist should have become a high priest because he's from the Zadok family. But because the Zadoks were pushed out, John the Baptist never could become high priest, and therefore he was part of the Essenes. Jesus went to John the Baptist to be baptized, and by doing that, he associated himself with the teachings and the group of Essenes at Qumran. He was taught and brought up in these teachings because the Nazarene at Mount Carmel followed the same teachings. Now, it's important to understand the teachings of the Essenes, or the Nazarenes, or the Therapitai in Egypt, to understand where Jesus' teachings is coming from. And there are 6 distinct things that Jesus literally taught through his parables and sayings that directly comes from the Essenes. And this can be found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls was rediscovered in the caves at Qumran because the Essene community, and for that matter, mostly all of Israel and Jerusalem and the temple, were destroyed in 70 after Christ, when the second Maccabean revolt just really irritated the Romans, and they said, we're going to squash these little people in Jerusalem. We literally did. 1.1 million, it is estimated, the amount of Jewish people that died when they destroyed the temple, Jerusalem, and all the villages around Jerusalem, including the Essenes at Qumran, including the Nazarenes at Mount Carmel. So there, the whole Essene group kind of stopped. Luckily for us, we have their writings that was kept in earthen vessels in the caves, and it was rediscovered in the early 1950s. And therefore, we have these teachings. Now, first of all, it is important to realize what Jesus taught, which is the same than what the Essenes taught, which also proved that he was part of the Essene group, although he was part of the Nazarenes, which were part of the bigger Essenes. Paul was also a Nazarene. Now, Paul definitely didn't come from Nazareth, but in the book of Acts, chapter 24, verse 5, when Paul was accused and they took him to Rome to be trialed, the accuser said, or to the magistrate, that this is Paul, he's a rioter, he stirs the people up in Jerusalem, he's a ringleader of the Nazarene. Go and read it. Acts chapter 24, verse 5. Paul was a ringleader of the Nazarene. So he was also part of the Essenes, and therefore his writings and his teachings correlate with that which Jesus taught in those days. Now, First of all, the Essenes were against alcohol. Now people would go like, oh, Jesus used alcohol to start the Holy Communion. He did not. Yayin is the Hebrew word that we translate as wine. Now yayin has two meanings. It means freshly squeezed grape juice less than 3 days old. The moment it's older than 3 days, remember Israel is a very humid and warm country. The moment it's older than 3 days, they didn't add refrigeration, so then it was regarded as fermented grape juice, which we call wine. So within yayin, there's two meanings. It's either the freshly squeezed, the best grape juice, which they always refer to, and then the older grape juice, which we refer to as wine. Sadly, when the translations were made from the original Hebrew and later Aramaic, this got lost because it was translated as only wine, and that's not the truth. So the best yayin, or the best grape juice, was always kept for special occasions. And when Jesus instituted the Holy Communion, he would have used the best yayin, which would have been fresh grape juice and not wine. So the Essenes were very against the use of alcohol, and they also said no use of alcohol socially. The only way they could use it was in religious functions or events. So Jesus would have been very anti-alcohol, meaning yayin older than 3 days old. The second one is that Jesus was also not pro-temple. So he was part of this group that moved away from the temple due to the political influence in the temple when the Zadoks were pushed out and the Hasmoneans took over the high priestship within the temple in Jerusalem. Jesus went there and he cleansed it, surely demonstrating, I do not agree with the greed and corruption that's going on in this place. So he distanced himself from the temple. He also distanced himself from the Pharisee, the Sadducee, and the scribes that were in the temple all the time. The third thing that Jesus, and you can go and read this in Matthew 6 verse 19 to 20, as well as in Luke 9 verse 3. The Essenes were very pro sell everything, bring all your belongings and give it to the community of the Essenes, and there we live in a communal setup. Now Jesus was very pro this. He also said, it's difficult for a rich man to get into heaven, even more difficult than for a camel to go through the eye of the needle. There's a big explanation around that. The eye of the needle was the small entrance next to the big entrance of the city of Jerusalem. And during nighttime, when they closed the big gates, people on foot could still enter the city through the eye of the needle. Now, Jesus comes and says it's more difficult for a rich man to come into the kingdom of God than for a camel, which it was almost impossible to get through the eye of the needle. So Jesus was very pro simplicity, very pro not so much poverty, but not pro greed and riches. And he made that very clear, and that was an Essene teaching. The next one that we read about, which is quite interesting, is that Jesus says in Matthew 6 verse 33, seek first. The most important thing that you need to do is seek the kingdom of God. And then in Luke 17 he says, this kingdom is not out there. Don't go if they call you and say, here the kingdom of God is. The kingdom of God is within you. So seek first the kingdom of God and its righteousness, which is within you. Now that is an Essene teachings. The Essene taught that they are there to seek the kingdom of God, and that kingdom of God is within them. That was a spiritual teaching. Remember, these Essene people were Jewish people. They came from Judaism. They read and believed in the Torah, and then they come with this spiritual teaching, which is remarkable to understand. And that is where Jesus got this teaching of the kingdom of God within us. You can go and read it in Matthew 6, verse 33. Never call a man your father, or never call an earthly man your master. Never give titles to earthly men. Matthew 23, verses 9 to 11. Another Essene teaching that Jesus picked up and taught. Jesus was absolutely against religious hierarchies, the Pope and then the priests and then the lay people down here. Or in the time of the temple, the high priest and then the priests and then the Pharisee and then the Sadducee and then the scribes and then the men and then the women and then the children. It's this strict hierarchy within religion, and Jesus was against that. That's why he mingled with women, he mingled with children, he mingled with the people that was pushed out of society, he touched the leper. All of that was a demonstration that he was against this hierarchy which we create through the politics in religion. And you can go and read about that in Matthew 23 when he says, you shouldn't be calling a man your master. You're not his slave. We are all equal in the eyes of God. That was a very important Essene teaching which Jesus used and taught in his day. There was an interesting greeting form. So in John 20 verse 21 we see that when Jesus comes and say, peace be with you, or peace be with this house. That's the way the Essenes went out into society when they did, or when they gathered into a group, they will start the gathering by saying this greeting, peace be with you. That's where we get our greeting from when we say that, peace be with you, or peace be with this house. And this is an Essene greeting, which Jesus picked up and which he used. This is very important to understand at this stage of our conversation, because as we go along, we're going to look now into the Christ aspect of Jesus. And where does the Christ fit in? And what does it actually mean? We spoke about Messiah thinking in the Old Testament. I will recall that and we'll look over at that again. But the Messiah idea in the Old Testament doesn't fit Jesus, not at all. And we will look into that again, because Jesus brought the Christ. And what is that? It is very important to understand the teachings of Jesus, which we spoke about now, and where they came from. They were inspired by the Essene, because Jesus was an Essene, because they call him the Nazarene. I hope you find this very interesting, and it will open a new world within your faith and within your journey towards God. See you next time.